A few weeks ago, most of us read in the journal World an excellent opinion piece that was co-authored by the people who are addressing us this morning. We're privileged to have them come here this morning. The title of their presentation is "The Time is Now. Activate Your Role in the Movement for Black Lives." Members of the Black Law Students Association at KU School of Law will provide us with some suggestions and resources we will need to activate our roles in the movement for Black lives. The treasurer is Tish Cooper, Vice President Olivia Black, and President Cortez Downey. They are all second-year law students at the University of Kansas, and as early joiners know, Newman Mulligan is their faculty advisor. Let's all welcome them by silently clapping in front of our cameras. And then Amanda, if you'll switch to speaker view for Cortez in his presentation.
Well, good morning again, everyone. Are you all able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to unmute, excuse me. I suggest that we all mute at this time.
Okay, thank you. Again, it is a pleasure to be here with you all today. We greatly appreciate the invitation to join with you. As was mentioned, my name is Cortez Downey. I'm the president of the Black Law Students Association at KU Law. And I'm joined today by Olivia Black, the vice president of the organization, Tish Cooper, our treasurer, and Professor Newman Mulligan, our faculty advisor. Just to tell you a little bit about BLSA at KU, BLSA's mission is to articulate and promote the educational, professional, political, and social needs and goals of Black law students and students of color, of Black law students and students of color, excuse me, of Black law students and students of color. Some of the initiatives that BLSA puts forward are a Thanksgiving food drive, where we collect canned goods and ethnic hair care products for community centers in Lawrence and the Kansas City area. We also host a Black History lecture series as well. In alignment with our mission, following recent events that have taken place in our country over the past several months, we decided that we would pen a statement that I believe many of you have probably seen at this point. One thing we would like to note is that our statement is, should be viewed as our thoughts and our suggestions, and we are simply members of a community sharing our thoughts. We're not seeking to speak on behalf of the entire Black community.
We would like to start with a statement to just refresh everyone's memory and kind of provide some context this morning for the suggestions that we have. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we watch the taking of yet another life at the hands of those whose duty is to serve and protect. We reach out today as we continue to grapple with the devastation caused by the most recent instances and a continuation of generations of violence against Black people in this country. The Black Law Students Association at the University of Kansas School of Law is part of the community that is under siege. We support, promote, and serve the needs and interests of Black law students and communities. And today, as always, we stand in solidarity with every person impacted by the plague of white supremacy and everyone who is working to dismantle anti-Blackness wherever or however it is found. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed fissures in our society, festering wounds that have remained hidden to some for years. But to Black and other marginalized communities, injustice and inequity have been felt throughout every generation. Today, we are struggling to make sense of the myriad of emotions we are experiencing, not only at the recent murder of Mr. George Floyd, but also at the thunderous silence of some of our coworkers, colleagues, professors, and even friends. Others do speak, but not as allies. Some weaponize their voice against the calls for justice. They prioritize the inconvenience of lost property over the tragedy of stolen life. Hear us. Black people across the country are literally protesting for their lives. We hear voices in solidarity too, but the time for memos and statements has long since passed. To our friends, peers, and colleagues who seek to be an allyship with our community, now is the time for action, not mere supportive words. Aspire to be accomplices for justice. To be an accomplice for justice, utilize your voices and relative positions of power and privilege in the following ways. First, see the bigger picture. While Mr. George Floyd's murder is top of mind right now, we also still mourn the deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Jamar Clark, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Stephon Clark, Botham Jean, Atiana Jefferson, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and sadly, the overwhelming list of others who will not, but deserve to be named here. Second, do not reduce this to politics. This movement is not about politics. It is about our lives and our humanity. Third, resist the urge to place qualifiers on Black life. Black lives matter, full stop. Fourth, take immediate action. Attend a protest in your area. Donate to bail funds to protesters in your area. Sign up to be a legal observer. Fifth, accept that it is not enough to be non-racist. Work to be anti-racist. Sixth, embrace the discomfort. You may feel uncomfortable discussing race, racism, and other injustices. Lean into this discomfort and push back on problematic words, mindsets, and actions from others, especially friends and family. Seventh, remain critical. Consider the ways in which the law, common legal practices, policies, and other systems are prejudiced or inequitable. Use your legal training and influence to change the law. Eighth, be critical of the version of history you have been taught. Consider the stories and perspectives that have been excluded. Ponder why they may have been left out and make time to learn more accurate, holistic versions of history. Ninth, seek accountability. Do what you can to hold local elected officials and law enforcement accountable for enacting and enforcing more equitable laws and practices. And finally, vote. If you have the privilege to vote, be sure to do so and encourage others to do so as well. Silence is acceptance. Inaction is complicity. BLSA reaches out today to call to action our allies turned accomplices. We encourage members of the Black community to lean into and experience each emotion, protect your energy at all costs. And we ask every single individual in every organization to demand justice by any and all means within your power. Sincerely, Cortez S. Downey, Olivia Black, Tish Cooper, and Professor Lumen Mulligan.
Thank you very much, Tish. At this time, we'll walk through a little bit about why we selected each of the action items that was included in the statement that Tish just read. And so, in consideration of seeing the bigger picture, as was mentioned, while the murder of George Floyd has kindled the most recent demonstrations, it is important to remember that to the Black community, George Floyd's murder is seen and felt as just the most recent installment in the series of state-sanctioned violence against Black people. It is also important to remember that there are many other individuals whose deaths didn't garner the same widespread media coverage. Most notably, the names of Black women and Black trans individuals are often omitted. But their names, although their names are often left out, they matter and they are a part of this bigger picture. It is easy for many people to write off Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives as a political issue. But people's humanity is never about politics. While the ways in which we go about protecting Black lives may involve political discourse, the notion that Black Lives Matter should never be seen as political. Resist the urge to place qualifiers on Black life. In grade school, I was often praised for the way I spoke, my behavior in school, and my academic performance in relation to some of my Black peers. While the praise may have been well-intentioned, the disparate impact is that in valuing my Black life by these certain metrics, my teachers would unintentionally devalue the Black lives of my peers who did not comport themselves in the ways I did. Similarly, when we place emphasis on the fact that a victim of police violence, for example, was unarmed, it sends a message that the killing of unarmed Black people is questionable, but the killing of armed Black people is justifiable. And in a nation that highly regards the perceived right to possess firearms, an individual being armed should not be the determining factor of whether that individual's murder warrants outrage or not. All Black life matters. This includes Black life that is uneducated, Black life that is indigent, Black life that is incarcerated, etc. All Black life matters. Take immediate action. There are organizations collecting bail funds for just about every major city in the United States, including our area here in the Kansas City area. The National Lawyers Guild and other organizations offer training for people willing to attend demonstrations to monitor police interactions and help ensure that demonstrators are not denied their rights. There's also a resource including information on where to donate, how to be trained to be a legal observer, as well as links to each of the other resources that will be mentioned shortly. This document was included in the original statement, and I'm sure it would be possible to get that shared to anyone who hasn't already seen it, who would like access to these various links and resources. Accept that it is not enough to be non-racist. Work to be anti-racist. This may seem counterintuitive. As long as I'm not racist, isn't that enough? Unfortunately, in the context of our society and our nation's history, to be non-racist is to be complicit, as it does nothing to upend racist policies, practices, and procedures and systems that have seeped into every crevice of our society. To be anti-racist means to daily work against the explicit and implicit messages we have received about who matters and who doesn't, about whose stories matter and whose don't, about whose lives matter and whose don't. Sorry, I'm not sure why my computer keeps wanting to jump to the end. Embrace the discomfort. Being anti-racist is difficult because it often puts us at odds with people we love or care about. It makes us question how we perceive them. It can sometimes cause us to question how we perceive ourselves. embrace the discomfort. Racism is uncomfortable. It makes sense that uprooting racism would be uncomfortable as well. Remain critical. Black people make up about 13% of the total US population, but I believe about 38% of incarcerated individuals are Black. If we do not remain critical, it may be easy to accept that this must simply be because Black people commit more crime. If we analyze rates of policing, various legal practices, the ways laws are applied, and the intersections of housing discrimination, inequitable distribution of funding for education, and inequitable access to quality healthcare, we can more fully understand the reality, however. It's important that we remain critical. We should also be critical of the version of history that we have been taught. Prior to law school, as Tish and I mentioned earlier, we were both teachers, and so we are pretty passionate about the value of education, the power of education. And while of course there is no one silver bullet to ending racism, I am partial to relying on education as a means of improving society, as I think many of us are. As young children, what we are taught early on shapes our thought patterns, which informs how we view ourselves and how we view others. As I mentioned briefly earlier as well, I'm originally from Oklahoma, and just the other day, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine, and we were discussing, what it means that both of us, having been educated from kindergarten through high school and even in college in the state of Oklahoma, but never being taught about the Tulsa Race Massacre in public schools. The stories that we knew of it came from family members, but it was not something that was included in our history textbooks, and we're from Oklahoma. It makes me think, what does that mean for there to be these significant stories in our nation's history that are not included in our public education? Something else that's kind of important for me as an educator is considering the messages we send students in our textbooks, for example. There were a number of articles that have been published over the past few years that explore the ways textbooks from states such as Texas, for example, tell certain stories versus textbooks that tell the same stories from states like California. And one such example was that in units about slavery, the some textbooks from Texas, for example, referred to enslaved Africans brought to the United States as immigrants and workers. And while that may not be a complete lie, it is a very drastic and dangerous distortion of the truth. And if we think about the ways that impacts how folks grow and think about our country and think about themselves, think about others, think about our history, we think about the impacts of that, it can be profound. So we should be critical of the versions of history that we have been taught. Seek accountability. Whether this involves attending city council meetings, writing letters, making phone calls, whatever it takes. Campaign Zero is an organization that has policy recommendations for communities seeking to end police violence. Such policies include demilitarization of police departments and a divestment of some police department funding to increase the number of social workers and other crisis intervention professionals. And again, as I mentioned, there's a resource with links to all this information so that you can take a look for yourselves, just to gain more understanding around some of the proposals and different ideas that other communities around the country are considering and some of the steps they are taking. And lastly but not least, vote. If you do have the privilege to vote, be sure to do so and encourage others to as well. I think for just speaking for myself, growing up, I would never really hear my parents talk much about who they were voting for. I never went with my parents to vote, for example. And it really wasn't until I was maybe in high school that I noticed my parents taking a more, I would say, active role. But even then, they would mostly vote in the presidential elections. I rarely heard my parents discuss our local elections, which in many for many reasons, right, are perhaps the most important. So doing whatever we can to make sure that we are utilizing our privilege to vote, as well as making sure that those around us, our friends and our families, are educated about various measures being voted on, about various candidates, so that we can ensure that our elected officials represent the best interests of our communities. We should absolutely exercise that privilege. And again, silence is acceptance, inaction is complicity. We all have a voice, and it is up to us to decide if and how we are going to utilize those voices. We all have relative positions of influence, positions of power. And again, it is our choice how we choose to leverage those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cortez. And I apologize. With our screens sharing system, we have to designate a co-host. So Lumen, that's why we were not able to show the ladies when they were speaking, but we're learning as we go along. We appreciate the presentation very much. We have ample opportunity to have some questions. Please unmute yourself, raise your hand, and we'll proceed with some Q&A. And I have one for the group as a whole, and that is within the state of Kansas, we assume that Blacks are incarcerated and have a felony record far in excess of their percentage of the population. Is there any means by which these people can be restored to vote? Maybe that's a question you don't know, but you could check on it and get back to us. In other words, Lumen?
In Kansas, not for folks who've been convicted of felonies. And that's a state law by state law matter. So we have a handful of states that have done that. Most recently, Florida has restored the right to vote for former felons. Much like Cortez said, this has been a matter that has become very much politicized under the assumption, which has actually been studied to be false, but under the assumption that former felons would vote disproportionately for the Democratic Party. There's been strong resistance to re-enfranchisement. But again, what's interesting about that, sociologists recently did a study that it's just not true. Former felons map the diversity of political views almost exactly the same as the general population. But it is one of those issues where you've allowed politics to get in the way of what might be viewed as fundamental rights.
Thank you. I think I saw another hand come up. Oh, Lynn Bodel, is that your hand asking a question, or do you have arthritis pain like me? Paul, please go ahead.
Oh, well, thanks very much for excellent presentation. I'm also very impressed that you have educational backgrounds. My wife and I were both educators, and a lot of people listening in are. And for me, one of the most eye-opening things on education was a book that I actually picked up in the Unitarian Library, Lies My Teacher Taught Me, which I'm sure a lot of you know. But it points out that there's the old saying that nobody seems to quite know who first said it, that winners write the history. But in the history of the Civil War, a lot of it was written from a very Southern point of view. And I can remember the textbooks we had in seventh, eighth, ninth grade, having cartoons taken from Reconstruction era of Black legislators wearing gold watches that they had voted themselves and so forth. And if you look at the actual history, there were a number of states that were very successfully governed in Reconstruction by a majority Black legislation until Jim Crow drove them out. There's all the talk about rewriting history by taking monuments down. Any suggestions how we go about rewriting actual history to set the record straight? I don't know who wants to answer that question, but just suggestions of how we get it in the public square.
You know, I think that that's a tough one. I think that a lot of what's taking place now is definitely a step in the right direction. Many folks who I would even say last year wouldn't have been as critical of why it is that some of these monuments are still, you know, so prominently placed in our country as almost a means of celebrating them. I think now a lot of people are considering that that actually doesn't make sense, that by placing these monuments in these places, we are glorifying something that probably shouldn't be glorified in our country. So I think the conversation is a great place to start.
I think we also have to start with teacher preparation. I think you'll still see that schools are pretty lack diversity as far as the teachers who are delivering instruction and administrators. So I think also at your local school level and school board, you need to see kind of who are your, who's facilitating the educational experience. A lot of our schools are still pretty inequitable, which is surprising. You know, we think that they have really risen to the occasion, but if you look at the statistics, a lot of minority students still don't see teachers who look like them in front of them. So you don't see diverse voices who are giving instruction. So, you know, I don't think it's anyone's fault of their own, but when you have your own voice, you tend to speak your own history and history the way you've been taught and seen it. So when you see diverse voices and allow diverse people to give input into curriculum instruction, I think that's when you'll start to see some movement too. I think the digital age has given us a unique opportunity to leverage, you know, other stories to pull in. It's easier, it's hard as teachers to prepare when you just have your book, but now we have the opportunity to bring in additional stories that we may be able to see with a different voice and a different narrative. So I think at your local school board and local school levels, kind of encourage them as well to make sure that we're exposing our kids to a variety of experiences and educational opportunities so that they grow up knowing that there isn't, you know, to be critical of, you know, what am I learning? How do I see it? How does it shape me as a person? And kind of how do I use it to propel us forward? I think all history deserves a seat at the table with that. So I think local school boards are definitely the best way to even get started with that.
Thank you.
Graham, can I jump in as a historian?
Please do, please do.
Long ago and far away, back in 1964, I was a graduate student at Penn State. And the first course I was assigned to teach was a course on modern American history. And modern American history began with Reconstruction. And the book that was assigned to my students by the professor who was running the overall class was a book by Dunning, which had written in 1907 and which was about as bad as you could possibly get on Reconstruction, on Black Reconstruction, and every other conceivable way of presenting the glories of the Old South, etc. And I was in the situation of having a professor lecture on this, students haven't read the book, and then I had to run a discussion group. This was 1964 when we were actually getting ready to pass civil rights legislation. And the student said, well, what about this? And I suggested, well, there are other books, and I mentioned C.N. Woodward, The Strange Life of Jim Crow. But I said the most important thing probably is to go back to Porgy and Bess. And they all looked at me, well, what's that? I said, well, there's a character in it by the name of Sporting Life. And what he says is, it tain't necessarily so. And you should read as broadly as you can and get other perspectives on things, because quite frankly, when someone hands you something from 40 years ago and says, this is the way you're supposed to see it now, they are in fact not exposing you to what has been transpired in the way things are looked at. I can remember this course on Reconstruction, and there wasn't a word about W.E.B. Du Bois. Not one word. And by the way, after that class, I was never asked to teach another American history course. I was allowed to teach European ones and Russian ones, but not an American one.
Oh, wow. Incredible.
So, Tom Craven, it's actually Gene Dirks. Hi, Gene.
Hi, I have a question. I noticed that the recent data from the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council in Douglas County noted that there's an equally high proportion of Native Americans as Blacks that are incarcerated in Douglas County out of proportion to the population. And I wondered if there's a way that we could all support or unite with both Black and Native people to get more fair representation, more fair results. I've also noticed that there's not much coordination in Lawrence with people from Haskell, and I wish there was. Is there anything that could be done in Douglas County to promote both causes or to join forces somehow?
I mean, there are more things you can do than you can shake a stick at. Let me offer a few thoughts. First, who the district attorney is matters a lot.
Yeah.
The district attorney in every location, including Douglas County, and his or her staff is vested with a lot of discretion. And it's the district attorney that pushes for money bond or not, or how much, whether to charge on this crime or the other crime, whether to offer diversion or not. All those types of things are vested within the discretion of the district attorney. So who that person is matters. It's been very uplifting to me to see the great attention and care that the community has paid to the district attorney race this year.
Yeah.
And I think that's outstanding. So just pay some attention to it. Read up on that and use your heart, and that will matter a lot. The second thing I would say is, in the United States, in Douglas County, incarceration follows socioeconomic factors. Since the only actual public mental health facilities we have in the United States are jails and prisons, and that mental health traumas follow intergenerational poverty, it's not surprising that our communities that have suffered that intergenerational poverty are the ones who are suffering from all the aftermath of that. And so you see that in Douglas County as a microcosm. So being able to support public health matters. And providing educational resources matters. The last thing it would be is pay close attention in our community to schools. It wasn't all that long ago when the school district here in Lawrence was trying to close down all the schools on the east side of town, right? while investing more on the west side of town, when lo and behold, when they actually did the study, there's more kids on the east side of town. And, you know, I don't think anyone, I think this gets to Cortez and Tish's and Olivia's point, that I don't think anyone on that school board was actively racist, but they had some assumptions that had not been questioned. And so it just that exactly as Cortez and Tish and Olivia say, be critical, think, ask questions. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And know that all these things are interconnected. We could go on and on, but those would be a few thoughts.
I'm hoping that some or all of the members of the KU Black Law Students Association can attend a budget hearing that'll be at the county court for mental health, and that they proceed with studies to determine why Black people are incarcerated at about 3 times the rate of white people in this county. It starts with the sheriff and police department pulling people over, as we know. I might ask, do any of you representatives from KU, are you familiar with a book that was co-authored by Charles Epp called Pulled Over? Cortez or Lumen or Olivia, do you know that book?
I'm not familiar.
Okay, so a professor at KU and colleagues did a study of 4,000 traffic tickets issued in Kansas City, Missouri, 2,000 to white drivers, 2,000 to Black drivers. 85% of the white drivers were pulled over because they had a broken tail light or were speeding or ran a stop sign, a traffic violation. 15% were pulled over because it was for investigative purposes. In the case of the Black people, 85% were pulled over for investigative purposes, only 15% for traffic violations. Trish, are you aware of that book?
I am not aware of that book, but I've heard of similar studies where like Blacks are pulled over just for like things like the car air freshener that dangles from your rearview mirror. That's just cause to pull you over because they could say it interferes with your line of vision. So more often are pulled over for those kind of initial stops that lead to, of course, greater traffic violations. Then, yeah, but it's the initial stop that's the problem.
John, I think you're ready to ask a question.
Not me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Paul?
Yeah, going back to the thing about education and educators here, one thing that really alarms me is I think public education is under assault, of course, now from the very top. And I think that's one of the most dangerous things we face from this administration and ingrained, because all of our speakers stressed how important education is. And just as an example, the hoo-ha about waivers so students can get out of failing schools, most of those waivers are supplements to pay to go to a private school. I think most of the people who may need to use them can't afford the rest of the tuition at the private school. They can't afford getting to that private school. So I think that's basically a cop-out for middle-class white folks, and it's not supporting, it's actually downgrading the public schools by creaming off the top, and you can go on and on. So I think when we go to the ballot box, we really need to keep that in front of us too, in local races and school board races and on and on.
Some of you know I spent 3 weeks in Selma, Alabama, and it's clear the white school board and the white county commissioners have reduced funding to the public schools to the absolute bare minimum, back to early Jim Crow days. and the middle class and affluent white people have established so-called Christian academies, which is where they send their students to avoid them being in the same education system, the public system, as the African Americans. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. It's a tragic thing. So here in our own county, our county commissioners for 4 years have refused to authorize a study of the rate of incarceration of minorities in our county. And it was only with the COVID-19 epidemic that they finally agreed to do something in the way of a study. So we have to keep our pressure on our county commissioners, regardless of their party they belong to.
This also ties nicely in with the point that you just made, along with the point that Tish made earlier as well, in regards to making sure that we're aware of what our school board members are up to. So I don't have very much context of public education here in Lawrence, but in Houston, we did a lot of organizing work around considering how was the Houston Independent School District's budget allocated. And so there was a lot of research and investigation that went into this. And what was found there was that over $18 million was actually allocated for police officers to be within the schools, and less than $7 million was being allocated for programs such as parent and community engagement, college readiness, dropout prevention, those sorts of things. And this could be, especially startling considering if you look at the data around who the police were arresting. It wasn't as though the police were necessarily keeping our children in our schools safe from folks outside of the school. The majority of, or just about all of the arrests were taking place actually within the schools, right? So they were there policing our students, not necessarily keeping them safe. So again, I'm not sure if there are even police in schools in Lawrence, but if, but regardless, I think that it still kind of speaks to the point of being critical of where's the money actually being allocated. What's the proportion to funds being allocated for school counselors and for other folks within our schools who can actually help our students.
This is not a race issue, but at the present time, they're struggling to maintain funding for one professional Burt Nash employee to be stationed at Lawrence High School and one at Free State. So in the case of Lawrence High School, they're trying to get funding for one full-time mental health worker, and the Lawrence High School football team has 10 coaches. I'm not kidding, 10 coaches. I enjoy a football game as much as anybody, but our funding priorities are totally askew.
Well, we also have, of course, police officers. I don't know how many in the schools, and I would think maybe mental health officers were more important and more useful. Cortez, excuse me for speaking without raising my hand. You may remember that George W. Bush promoted the Houston, I don't even remember his title, but the overseer of Houston schools to Secretary of Education because the Houston schools were so successful. Turns out the reason they were so successful in George W. Bush's eyes was because they scored very high on Texas history exams. But I think it's an open secret that Houston schools are in very, very bad shape. And that, well, my grandchildren in Houston, I'd say, thank heaven, went to a private Montessori school. And after one semester in the Houston school district, their parents realized it wasn't going to work very well. They could afford to get out, but the others couldn't.
And I think that's a significant challenge. The Houston Independent School District, as many of our large urban school districts do, they get a bad rap. But the reality is there's so much that that the teachers are trying to do with such limited resources. There's then not the appropriate resources available to help, many parents and continue that education at home. And then if we think about how all of these inequities are exacerbated by high stakes testing, right? A lot of our school districts are having to focus so heavily on ensuring that their students are ready to reach these benchmarks in testing that they're unable to teach the total child, right? And so a district like Houston, for example, it's unfortunate, but like many of our districts, so much emphasis is put on these tests because that's, such a big chunk of the school's funding, right? All of this. And so it's a shame that that is the case, but that's our reality.
Yeah, I think teachers everywhere are very frustrated by using the tests as the standard for school excellence promotion, on and on, funding.
And I think you make good points too about the mental health connection. Until we start focusing on mental health and emotional and social issues and how that plays into criminal behavior, I think that also is a huge marker of recidivism and all those other things. Is, how emotional stable are our kids, even as juveniles, when they get caught up in the system. I remember teaching kids that come to school with ankle bracelets already. So, can you imagine how cruel kids are already? And you're sitting here with this ankle bracelet on. So you're criminalized even just sitting in the classroom. So we also need to kind of think about how are we treating our juveniles once they get into the legal system? What are we trying to do to make sure that their behavior just sticks to as a juvenile, that we invest in them educationally and give those support so that when they become adults, they don't become repeat offenders and end up lifelong in the system as well. So I think that whole connection, it's a big issue, and I'm very glad to see that your congregation is very aware that that mental health piece is a huge marker of criminal behavior as well.
Emily?
Okay, as an old Head Start person, the big difference between the way Head Start was, this is back in the 60s even, the parents were partners, not people that we talked down to and led. The parents were partners in the running of it and what we taught and how we taught them, and they helped with being teachers. And I think a lot of it is in our educational system and just maybe our society in large that, we're going to do these things for you, but we're going to do it our way. And then you just are supposed to be grateful. And I think if we get the parents, the families involved right away, as much as they can be, with the education, and empowered also, that would make a change in the whole thing.
Thank you, Emily.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that this is something that I would hear sometimes from colleagues as well. Folks would complain, well, parents just won't show up, or parents just want this, or parents just want that. But I think, to your point, it's a lot of it is the responsibility of the school to ensure that the school is presenting itself as a place that is inviting and welcoming parents' feedback and parents' presence in their child's education.
I have a question. I think if you see our group view here, we're mainly a predominantly white congregation, which is typical of many Unitarian congregations and others, whether they're Methodists or Presbyterians. When Martin Luther King called for people to go to Selma and march with him, I think around 400 Unitarian ministers showed up, but that was 52 years ago. And now on the 31st of the month, we had a demonstration down at South Park, and I think we had about 4 Unitarians show up. So we've got our homework to do, friends. And I'm asking our panel people this morning if you have any suggestions on immediate response or how we can hook up or what we can do, especially during this pandemic.
I think as religious leaders, I think the church has always been on the front line of connecting. So I think the work that you're already doing by inviting in speakers and people who are running for office and educating your congregation so that they can also educate their family and friends is tremendously important. I grew up in church, of course, and I remember being moved by those speakers, and that my pastor felt, passionate enough to see what was going on in the community to make sure that they invite in those people and make sure that they see the responsibility and the power that religious organizations hold in making a difference and making a change. So I think just continue the work that you're doing and also connect with those other ministers that are in your community. I think Zoom and digital age allows us to connect with people across the country, which is an exciting thing that we've kind of learned from this COVID pandemic, is that, our borders aren't as narrow as they used to be, that we have a chance to see other programming that's going on around the country and connect and link up and join forces and really make some effective changes. So I think the work that you're doing is awesome, and we're so honored that you invited us this morning. So I think continuing on the path that you're on and making sure you're taking advantage of these digital resources to kind of link up and join forces, and I think we'll make a really substantial change and a difference.
Thank you so much. Trish, do any of your co-panelists have any closing comments they'd like to make to us?
Hi, Olivia here. I just want to thank you guys as well for this opportunity. Just enlightening on my side, because I didn't come from an educational background, but I did consider why I received the education that I did. But at the same time, I so appreciate all of you just being here open-minded and listening to our side, but also inviting us to hear you guys out from marching with individuals in Selma, Alabama, and all the things that you guys have progressed. I just thank you guys. So.
Cortez, would you say a few words before we secure the meeting?
Sure. Again, thank you all for the invitation. I think as has been mentioned, I think Tish has mentioned as well, continuing to connect with other folks, in the community. As we mentioned at the onset, we consider ourselves guests here in Lawrence. We're not from Lawrence, but given that we will be here for the next few years at least, we absolutely want to be a part of the community, but there is such a wealth of knowledge and experience of folks who have been here. And so finding ways to elevate those folks' voices and just making sure that folks are connected and able to work together, I think, will go such a long way. So again, thank you all.
We thank you, and we thank you for this presentation, which we hope will exemplify future discussions in the community, which are in a conversational tone, exchanging information, and lacking the strident hyperbole that so many of our public gatherings these days degenerate into. So a final round of applause. Thank you so much. I'll ask Amanda now if she could terminate the meeting, and I thank you, our guests. Again, we'll be in touch.